Nothing like a bit of outside pressure to concentrate the minds. Dateline, Rimbo Castle, north of the Swedish capital Stockholm, where warring sides in Yemen's civil war have sat down in the same room for the first time in 2 years. They're not quite speaking directly to each other, but there's talk of prisoner swaps, airport reopenings, and truces, raising hopes. Why now and not before? Well, the murder of some Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi is playing a big factor. Since then, policymakers in Washington have lost patience with Riyadh and its bombing campaign in the Arab world's poorest nation. Then there's OPEC. Donald Trump's been loath to directly implicate the Saudi crown prince Mohammed bin Salman in the murder of Khashoggi, but ahead of a crucial meeting of the cartel of oil exporting nations in Vienna, he's been pressuring the world's biggest producer to keep prices low. Will MBS listen? Part of the answer may lie in Moscow. The whole world watched that public display of affection between MBS and Vladimir Putin last Friday at the G20 summit in Argentina. Will the Russians agree to OPEC's production cut? How much will what they decide matter? After all, thanks to shale oil, the U.S. now pumps out more crude than either the Russians or the Saudis. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the pressure on MBS. And joining us from Vienna, historian Ellen Wald, who is the president of Transversal Consulting, the author of Saudi Inc., the Arabian Kingdom's Pursuit of Profit and Power. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
From Riyadh, Salman Al-Ansari, founder and president of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Francois.
From Washington, Thomas Lipton of the Middle East Institute, the author of Saudi Arabia on the Edge, the Uncertain Future of an American Ally. Nice to see you.
Happy to be here.
From Abu Dhabi, Hussein Ibish, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf Institute in Washington. Welcome to the show. The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. There's been so much bad news in war-torn, famine-threatened Yemen that it's worth cheering. The revelations that those talks have opened, there has been that goodwill gesture that's in the works, the freeing by both sides of thousands of prisoners in a 3-year-old conflict. Owen Barnell has more.
A first step towards ending the catastrophic war in Yemen. At this castle outside Stockholm, peace talks have begun. Representatives from the Saudi-backed internationally recognized government and the Iran-aligned Houthi rebel group sat down for the first UN-backed negotiations since 2016.
It demonstrates to the international community here represented and to whom we speak, to each other, and most importantly to the people of Yemen, that you're ready to come together in the name of a peaceful political solution to the conflict.
An important milestone, though UN officials say they don't expect rapid progress to be made on a political settlement. But there's hope in Yemen that the talks might at least help the humanitarian situation.
On behalf of every single of the 15 million children in Yemen, there is only one message to those who are gathering today in Sweden. That is the message of peace for this brutal war, the brutal war on children raging throughout the country for too long, for that war to stop now.
Almost 4 years of conflict has claimed at least 10,000 lives and has created the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with an estimated 12 million people suffering from severe hunger. Just getting the two sides in the same place is seen as a significant step. To ensure the Houthis' attendance, the UN envoy Martin Griffiths accompanied them personally from the rebel-held capital Sana'a. His confidence-building measures included a prisoner swap and the evacuation of wounded rebels for treatment ahead of the talks.
Hussein Ibish, are we at a turning point for Yemen?
I hope so, and I think we may well be. There's a critical mass again. I think we saw such a mass building about a year ago, where the Yemeni parties were starting to move towards a dialogue that could have produced the beginning of a political settlement. But then you had the killing of the former president Ali Abdullah Saleh, and the equation changed. And I think for various reasons, both internal to Yemen and to do with other matters, as well as the fatigue of the coalition and pressure on the coalition, yes, we are in a situation where, for the first time in a long time, you can imagine that we're at the beginning of a process that can produce at least a lull in fighting sufficient to address the humanitarian situation and begin some reconstruction.
We saw there was a measure that was voted in the U.S. Senate. How much of it is due to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi?
Well, not much, I don't think. I think that just has solidified a sense in the United States that Saudi Arabia is acting in a reckless manner. But there was already a great deal of disquiet about the Yemen war in Congress, and a similar resolution only failed by 6 votes in the Senate many months ago. So it needn't have taken very much to push it over the edge. Now, the Khashoggi murder definitely has affected the overall view of Saudi Arabia and the Saudi government in a very negative way in Washington and in the Congress. But I think the Yemen issue was going in that direction anyway. And I think before Mr. Khashoggi was killed, there was a new consensus in the administration, including in the Pentagon, that it's time for the war to end.
Thomas Lippin, you agree?
I agree with Hussein Ibish that there was war fatigue growing in Washington even before the Khashoggi murder. After all, the Trump administration had already announced that it would no longer provide aerial refueling support for the Saudi bombing campaign. But there are 2 different issues here. One is ending the bombing campaign and alleviating the humanitarian situation in Yemen. The other is to end the civil war in Yemen and stabilize the country itself, where it's not just about the Saudis versus the Houthis. You also have the southern separatists, and you have the Islamic State, which would not be party to anything worked out in Stockholm.
And as a result, because seen from the outside, Thomas, the Yemen conflict has been painted in broad brushstrokes as being the Saudi-led coalition versus the Iran-aligned Houthis.
Well, that's partly because that's the way the Saudis have wanted to present it. They sold this to the Saudi people, and I've been in Saudi Arabia and asked them about it. They sold this to the Saudi people as what we call in Washington a war of necessity, not a war of choice. That is to say, it was necessary to do this in order to prevent Iranian encirclement of Saudi Arabia and the establishment of a sort of Hezbollah state on Saudi Arabia's southern border. There's no nuance in that presentation, whereas actually there really is much more to that.
Salman al-Ansari, is there war fatigue when it comes to Yemen where you are?
Thank you so much. I think, as your guest has mentioned, it's a necessity. It's a very important war to launch to get the Iranian-backed militia out of the equation, because there's no other choice for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the legitimate government of Yemen and the Arab coalition. So they needed to liberate Yemen from this Hezbollah-like militia. And I think there are a lot of progress that happened. More than 85% of the Yemeni land have been liberated, and now it's under the Yemeni government. And when we look at the humanitarian assistance, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where I am right now, they provided more than $14 billion in humanitarian assistance, mostly to the United Nations funds that are assigned to help the Yemenis. And it's very important to look for this talk right now in Stockholm, because the Houthis would not have come to the Stockholm talks without having themselves to be pressured in specifically Hodeidah, because it's the port where they get most of their weapons and supports from the radical Iranian regime. So I think it's important for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for the government of Yemen and the whole coalition to push the Houthis more and more, so they can have real substantial concessions on the ground.
Even though the fight for that port is threatening some 14 million people with starvation.
Actually, there are 22 ports, dry ones and normal ones. And most of the international media is talking about nothing but the Hodeidah. So if we look at the Hodeidah, most of the humanitarian assistance that come from the United Nations and from the international community goes to the hands of the Houthis, and the Houthis would use it to suppress the people, not to help the people. So it's very important to name things by their names. There are more than 22 ports already, and Saudi Arabia have provided this $14 billion. By far, it's the biggest contribution of any other country in the world. So I think we should not exaggerate about the thing about the Hodeidah port, because most of the Iranian-backed propaganda machine is pushing to make the international media think that the moment you liberate Hodeidah or the moment you have fighting in Hodeidah is the moment you have a catastrophe. We are already seeing a catastrophe in Yemen. We are already seeing a catastrophe in Yemen because of the Houthis and how they advanced in acquiring and controlling these cities, and by recruiting children as child soldiers. So I think it's very important, because we are not in a position where we have to choose either to have a Hezbollah-like group in the southern part of Saudi Arabia or not. It's a necessity, and we need to get the Iranian regime out of the equation in the Arabian Peninsula.
A necessity, you say. Ellen Wald, how do you read the situation in Yemen?
I think part of the issue that we're seeing here is that the U.S. views Saudi Arabia as a strategic partner in this, and they'd like to see more stability come to Yemen. There's a great deal of al-Qaeda activity there that the U.S. really does not want to see continue. But at a certain point, they're saying to themselves, when is this war going to come to an end? When either are the Saudis going to seal the deal and end this? I mean, this has been going on for quite some time now, and the humanitarian crisis is now becoming a liability from the U.S. perspective. So at a certain point, I think that they're going to apply pressure to wrap this up.
Apply pressure, and again, we've seen that pressure rise, Ellen Wald, ever since the murder 2 months ago of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
Exactly, and you know, as everyone else has said, there was pressure building regarding this, but the Khashoggi murder has really brought it to a head, and there is definitely sentiment in Congress for politicians to get on the record as opposing this war as a way of expressing their discontent. So I think a lot of the Khashoggi discontent is coming out in the Yemen issue.
Back in the U.S. Capitol, activists haven't forgotten renaming the street outside the Saudi embassy Khashoggi Way. It's an informal move since those activists didn't have the approval of the Washington, D.C. City Council. But no matter, there is plenty of pressure as well on Capitol Hill, where this week the CIA director briefed senators.
I have zero question in my mind that the Crown Prince, MBS, ordered the killing, monitored the killing, knew exactly what was happening, planned it in advance. If he was in front of a jury, he would be convicted in 30 minutes, guilty. So the question is, what do we do about that?
Thomas Lippman, what's the answer to that question?
There is no answer. You heard the question, what do we do about that? The resolution that's pending in the Senate probably will not pass the whole Congress. And even if it does, President Trump will veto it, and then this Congress will expire, and that resolution will expire with it. What's going to happen in real terms is not a function of the Congress, and so, or at least not in the short term. And so the United States is in a very difficult situation, because as President Trump and Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mattis have made clear, the relationship with Saudi Arabia is very important for strategic and economic reasons. And if the head of the Saudi regime becomes, in effect, persona non grata, it's not clear how the United States can balance this or achieve any kind of justice in the Khashoggi case.
All right, on Wednesday, we saw the Saudi embassy in Washington confirming the return of its ambassador to the United States, 30-year-old Khalid Ben Salman, the younger brother of MBS, who's been out of the country since Khashoggi's murder, and according to the Wall Street Journal, traded text messages with the latter, assuring Khashoggi it was safe to go to the consulate in Istanbul. Hussein Ibish, what are your thoughts on what's going on in Washington right now?
Well, I think what's happening really in the big picture is that U.S.-Saudi relations have become a partisan issue. There are at least two different groups of important people in Congress and in Washington who are using the Yemen issue, the Khashoggi issue, and the U.S.-Saudi relationship for political ends. The first are Democrats in general. They need to attack the president on foreign policy. They do that on Russia. They do it on North Korea. But when it comes to the Middle East, it's going to be Saudi Arabia that they use to attack the president. And they would probably do it on Israel, but there's too much domestic support for Israel. It come at a high cost. So they're not likely to do that. They're going to focus on Saudi Arabia and use it as a cudgel to bash the administration. And there's a lot to work with here between Yemen and Khashoggi murder and other things. The second thing is that there are also people inside the Republican Party who want to pressure the administration to adopt a more traditionally conservative internationalist foreign policy, even some who are largely supportive of the president now, like Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio, and others who do want to push the administration to get closer to, say, a George W. Bush approach or a more traditional Republican and internationalist approach. And they, too, are using Saudi Arabia as an issue that's representative of a broader failure. I think a tremendous amount of anxieties, concerns, and issues came together around the Khashoggi murder, and that now has incorporated Yemen into it, that cut across the American political spectrum, that have made this all really a focus. And I think when the Democrats take control of Congress in January, it's going to be an issue that repeatedly comes up in investigations, in hearings, et cetera. And it's going to be a tough year for Saudi Arabia in 2019 in Washington, no question.
All right, Donald Trump supportive on some issues.
Allow me to add one comment.
We're going to have to take a very quick break, Saman, but we'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the pressure on Saudi Arabia and its crown prince MBS. We've been talking about Yemen. We've been talking about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. We'll also talk about the pressure over the price of oil in Vienna, where there's that OPEC meeting going on. Is Ellen Wald of Transversal Consulting, the author of Saudi Inc., The Arabian Kingdom's Pursuit of Profit and Power, joining us from Riyadh. Saman Al-Ansari, founder and president of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. From Washington, Thomas Lippman of the Middle East Institute and the author of Saudi Arabia on the Edge, the Uncertain Future of an American Ally. And from Abu Dhabi, Hussein Ibish, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf Institute in Washington. Thomas Lippman, I was asking Hussein, let me ask you about the timing of this return of Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the United States to where you are in Washington.
Well, I have to say that up to now, this particular Saudi ambassador has not had much of an impact or been taken very seriously in Washington because he's a very junior person, I mean, in terms of age and in terms of experience, and because the President of the United States has a direct relationship with the Crown Prince, the ambassador's older brother. I think it's possible that the ambassador did not, in fact, know of what was going to happen to Khashoggi when he went into the consulate. And until proven otherwise, we could give him the benefit of the doubt. So I don't attach too much significance to his return to Washington.
Saman Al-Ansari, your thought, we heard just before the break, Hussein Ibish warning it's going to be testy times ahead for Saudi Arabia's special relationship with the United States.
I think Hussein has mentioned some facts with regards to the challenges that are faced in the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States. But to be honest, for my personal kind of perspective, I think I'm not worried about Saudi-US relationship. What I'm worried about is US-US relationship. The US is having a divide that is not helpful, not for only the United States, but also for the international community and for the United States allies. I think this issue will be passed. I think the United States needs Saudi Arabia as much as Saudi Arabia needs the United States. Saudi Arabia is the biggest country in the Middle East, the biggest oil producer and exporter for so many years. And it's also the hub and the hub of the whole Arab and Muslim world. So we are speaking of a country that is not just like any other country. So I think the Saudi-US relationship will be back on track. But what surprised me, to be honest, was the use of the language of some of the US Congress members. That was not acceptable at all. The moment you want to convince the Saudis that the leadership of Saudi Arabia is something and the Saudi Arabia is something else, this is a big mistake you should not commit at all. The Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is a representative of all Saudi citizens. We are speaking of 70% of the Saudi population under the age of 30 years old. And we see the hope and we see the future through the Crown Prince. And we are saying this not to just massage the reputation of Saudi Arabia. We know that we are having a reputational damage that is considered to be unprecedented after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And we know that the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was a crime and was a heinous crime, and that needs to be investigated. And the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is going through this process. But we do not allow any nation or any politician to just go and tell the Saudi citizens whom they should have as their leadership. I think we should go after the true relations between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United States. We're not speaking of only an oil producer and exporter to the United States. The United States itself is the biggest oil producer. We know that. We know we are not living in an era of oil for security. We are living right now in an era of trade and security for trade and security. So we are in a position where we can talk to the United States as equal. We are not going to be in a position where we listen to them and respect all what they say,
put that point
specifically when it comes to.
Let me put that point to Ellen Wald. Ellen, who's got more leverage right now in that relationship between Riyadh and Washington?
Right now, I have to say it's entirely the United States. If you look at the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States right now, first of all, the United States does not consider Saudi Arabia an ally. Saudi Arabia is a strategic partner with the aim to achieve certain discrete aims. And right now, I think, particularly with regards to the war in Yemen, those aims aren't necessarily being achieved. If you look at the GDP per capita of Saudi Arabia, it's minimal compared to the United States. There's no way that the United States and Saudi Arabia are on an equal playing field now. And
but Saudi Arabia does have a special place in Donald Trump's heart, especially with a view towards punishing Iran.
Well, let's look at his relationship with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a strategic partner, but I don't think he sees necessarily the current leadership as good friends. Not that he wants to necessarily change it, but there's nothing that the president loves more than leverage. And this new resolution that's going through Congress could provide him with leverage to push Saudi Arabia on exactly the points that he wants, including maybe doing more in Yemen to get rid of Iran, to achieve the goals that the United States wants to achieve. If you think about it, Saudi Arabia has not entirely achieved these goals yet. And President Trump could hold that resolution over the head of the Saudis in order to push back and get what he wants, maybe get movement on an Israeli-Palestinian peace initiative to end this war in Yemen that's become a disaster, and to do more in terms of funding anti-terrorism.
Hussein Ibish, you agree?
Sort of. I mean, I agree with both of the previous commentators. Ellen makes a very good point that the United States has a set of advantages that Saudi Arabia doesn't, and these are not equal partners. On the other hand, to really rethink the U.S.-Saudi relationship at a fundamental level, at a structural level, involving things like military ties, security cooperation, counterterrorism, intelligence, and work to manage the global energy markets, and those are the structural aspects of the Saudi relationship, would require a reorientation of the American strategic posture entirely. In other words, they are mutually dependent. I don't think anyone in their right mind in the United States thinks it's a good idea right now to completely restructure the U.S. strategic posture in the Middle East as a whole, in the Gulf region, and even to some extent in the whole world. And so I do agree, actually, with our colleague in Riyadh that in the end, the U.S.-Saudi relationship will right itself and will be all right. And I think in the end, this is a difficult period, but I think in the end, this is an indispensable relationship. That doesn't mean both sides are equally powerful or both sides need each other equally, but they both need each other enough that they don't have good options.
Well, that brings us to what's going on in Vienna. OPEC tentatively agreeing an oil output cut, but the ministers waiting on non-cartel member Russia before announcing the volumes. The Saudi oil minister says he's not confident that they're going to come up with an agreement. Markets are skeptical as well that they'll be able to agree at OPEC to tighten the faucet much. Oil, which had hit $70 a barrel a few months back, now flirting with $50 a barrel. Ahead of the meeting, Donald Trump tweeting his preference Wednesday, quote, hopefully OPEC will be keeping oil flows as is, not restricted. The world does not want to see or need higher oil prices, exclamation point. Well, that's drawn a diplomatic rebuttal from the Saudis.
He has every right to wish for affordability of energy for the citizens of the United States. And he is very vocal, using his favorite communication tool, which is Twitter, and we hear him and we take his views seriously. But we also take the views of Prime Minister Modi, who's equally vocal.
And the views you could add to that, Thomas Lipman, of Vladimir Putin. We recall that high five we saw in Buenos Aires at the G20 summit between MBS and Putin.
Well, look, Saudi Arabia is in a really difficult position here. The Saudis have no incentive to lower the price of oil. They're dependent on oil revenue, and they're below the budget balancing level now. They have no incentive to lower the price of oil. The only reason to lower the price of oil is the spectacular ignorance of Donald Trump of how the oil market works. The fact is that the price of oil right now is not a big issue in the United States. In the United States today, a liter of milk is more expensive than a liter of gasoline. Gasoline is cheap, and Trump is making a phony issue out of this. But the Saudis don't want to further alienate anyone in Washington. And so they have to pretend to be trying to cut the price in order to better strengthen themselves without really doing it, which seems to be what's happening in this OPEC meeting.
And what about, though, the relationship between the Saudis and the Russians?
Well, look, it was almost inevitable that given Russia's new aggressive internationalism and Saudi Arabia's instinct for self-preservation, I think it was almost inevitable that the Saudis would find new opportunities to do business or distance themselves from the United States in their own interests. I don't think you're going to see the kind of role in Russia, the Russian role in the Middle East that the Soviet Union had in the days of the Cold War. But the days when Saudi Arabia was totally dependent on the United States for all its commercial as well as its military transactions can and should come to an end.
Ellen Wald, what's it like? Tell us a little bit about that summit that's going on, that OPEC meeting, rather, that's taking place where you are.
Yeah, so I was in the Secretariat all day today, and we were waiting all day to hear news of this potential cut. They're talking about 1 million barrels per day with then an additional add-in from Russia. And in the end of the day, it didn't materialize. And I think the problem is this. Yes, Saudi Arabia is concerned about getting negative feedback from Washington, from Trump, but at the same time, it's got to manage all of these different moving parts within OPEC, particularly members that are upset with Saudi Arabia's new focus on Russia, but they're also upset with the fact that Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq have been overproducing their quotas, so they'd like these countries to cut. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, it doesn't want to cut if nobody else is going to cut, and part of that is getting Russia to buy in. And so a couple of years ago, we saw that OPEC was able to come to a agreement to cut only after Russia phoned in and committed to a cut. And we didn't see that today. So they really are holding off, waiting for tomorrow. But we've got to get, they've got to settle this issue amongst themselves. Is Iran going to get an exemption? Is Venezuela going to get an exemption? What about Libya? And it's really almost become a mess here. And we're just waiting on tomorrow.
A mess. What'll happen to the price of oil if they don't come to an agreement?
It will go down. If the market is expecting at least a 1.4 million barrel per day cut, and if they produce anything less than that, it's likely the market will go down. However, if they do come in with a cut, even if it's less than expected, over time it will balance out and the market will come back up.
Hussein Ibish?
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to say vis-a-vis the Saudi-Russian relationship, it's important leverage for Saudi Arabia in dealing with Washington, precisely because of the power imbalance. We've been talking about it. The Saudis wanted to buy THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Missile Defense System. They were, both parties were dragging their feet. It just got approved by the State Department, and it's going forward, I think. One of the major reasons for that is Saudis started talking very publicly with the Russians about buying the S-400. Which is sort of an alternative. And I think that lit a fire under the backsides of people in Washington that this $15 billion sale might not happen. And it's going forward. So, the Saudis can play the Russians off against the Americans to good effect as long as they don't overdo it.
As long as they don't overdo it. A little over a decade ago, the United States was importing 13 million barrels of oil a day. Now, thanks to shale oil and gas, its production has gone ahead of that of Saudi Arabia and Russia. And the U.S. could be importing a mere 330,000 barrels of crude by the end of next year. Salman al-Ansari, that brings us back to the question of earlier of who's got leverage on who?
Can I interject something here?
I think everyone is trying to... Excuse me?
Sorry, Salman al-Ansari and then Thomas Lippman.
Sure. I think everyone is trying to have a win-win kind of policy with regards to oil policy. Saudi Arabia was clear about meeting the demands. It's just the game of the supply and demand, etc. We have to look at what happened 6 months ago when the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and OPEC members decided to increase the production so the price would not go to 100. And we didn't get a lot of clapping for that. And right now, what we want to do is just to get to have a balanced kind of price, because as your guest has mentioned, it's almost not fair for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to have a price of oil that is like around 60s, because at least I think the fair price for the kingdom is 75 to 85. But overall, I think it's important for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the OPEC members to talk with the non-OPEC member, which is Russia, because we're speaking of the United States, Russia, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia being the biggest producers of oil. So it's important to talk to the Russians to see if there is a way we can decrease the level of production, even if it's symbolic. Even if it's symbolic, because when I say symbolic, I mean 500, 600,000 barrels per day. That would be in itself is significant. It's not going to be something to keep the market going in a down trend. So I think it's important for all the members to talk and to negotiate this and to get to a deal or to a decision that would not harm neither the United States nor Russia nor the OPEC members. In general, OPEC plus the United States plus Russia, they are producing more than 56 million barrels per day. And we are speaking of 60% of the world consumption of oil. So they are very important in making sure that there is a level of stability when it comes to the oil prices. And let's hope for the best. I think tomorrow is going to be the final decision of OPEC members, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will decide with Russia and the OPEC members of how to move forward and what is the real volume of oil oil barrels that they want to decrease. So let's hope for the best. And I'm sure that the United States will not get upset about it. Trump was right, actually, in my opinion. He wanted to push for a better price. When I mean a better price, I mean lower prices because of the short-term benefits of the U.S. economy. It's understandable, but we have to understand that a fair oil price is even good for the United States. If it's around 70 to 80, I think it's going to be better for the United States in the medium and long run.
Thomas Lippman, it won't be better for those French yellow vests who've been striking on the protesting here in France and who feel the pinch when the price at the pump goes up. Tell us what you think your crystal ball has.
But wait a minute. Those French yellow vests are not protesting the price of oil set by OPEC or Saudi Arabia or Kuwait. They're protesting a big price increase set by their own government. And that's where this situation gets complicated. In the United States, if you want to see cheaper gasoline, every state legislature in the United States has the power to reduce the price of gasoline. All they have to do is reduce the tax on it. They don't do it because they want the money. The producers are the same. Why should they reduce the price? They want the money. Furthermore, a reduction in the market, in the price of oil, hurts all those people in the United States producing all that shale oil that has changed the energy balance. And so there are as many negatives to a lower price as there are positives. And Trump has no understanding of that whatsoever.
Ellen Wall, do you agree?
I do think that they're in a difficult situation when it comes to the shale oil producers. I know a lot of people like to say that, break-evens are so low and technology has reduced the cost, but it is true that they are feeling the pinch with WTI so low. But also there's Canada to be concerned about, and Canada has announced an effective reduction of over 300,000 barrels per day coming in January. And so that's got to be a factor as well. But right now, Khalid al-Falih has a lot to balance. He's been criticized for being too close to Russia, in effect, even though it's that relationship with Alexander Novak that has enabled this deal to go on for so long. And they do see a strategic advantage in this relationship with Russia. I know they're pursuing talks for nuclear technology to build nuclear power plants in Saudi Arabia and also on natural gas efforts. So this relationship between Saudi Arabia and Russia in energy is not going away no matter what happens at OPEC tomorrow.
Ellen Wald, many thanks for joining us from Vienna. I want to thank Thomas Lippman in Washington, Hussein Ibish in Abu Dhabi, and Salman Al-Ansari in Riyadh. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. Enter Nicholas Rushworth. How are you?
Hi to you, Francois. And of course, that whole question of the oil in the equation of the Yemen conflict and the geopolitics of the region and beyond as well, Russia, as you were talking about there. Let's look at this cartoon in the Gulf press showing the king of Saudi Arabia there. And the whole question of money and oil. And if you look closely at the bottom, you've got here in red, that is the word Yemen there, which is this balance. Another equation for you is that the humanitarian disaster that we're seeing at the same time, business, finance, and so on. Before I go into what kind of the relations between Trump and the administration and Saudi Arabia, I want to have a look a little bit about just latest developments in the last few hours with the peace discussions in Rimbo, just north of Stockholm. The Red Cross is saying, it's actually reported by Al Arabiya, saying that there will be a prisoner exchange, and the Red Cross there is actually offering to help in organizing that. So that's really striking, because just in June we saw 71 Red Cross staff actually removed from the country. They left, didn't they? So that's a
very hopeful sign.
Absolutely. If you look at the tweet there, it says this is one of the first positive steps for Yemen. Now, of course, in these talks in Rimbo, just north of Stockholm, the key word seems to be de-escalation. In terms of breakthrough between the warring sides, that seems at this point still impossible. But we can go to perhaps just looking at world headlines about these Yemeni peace talks. This is the one that kind of sums up the consensus. Cautious optimism reigns. There are the elements for kind of creeping out of the crisis. Martin Griffiths, who's the UN Yemeni envoy, he's actually written in the New York Times, there he is, and his comment piece in the New York Times again echoes that idea of cautious optimism. He's saying there is renewed hope for peace. And he is really saying it's reached such a deadlock now that there will have to be a give and take. The progress made in the next few days, he says, could chase the spectre of famine away. We know that 12, 14, 15 million people are affected by extreme emergency situation and some affected by cholera. There he's saying renewed peace, but of course when you don't need to flip around the US press that much to see comment pieces about Trump and what he's actually going to do in terms of the Saudis and this conflict in the region. This is the Boston Globe's cartoon today saying, Khashoggi, yeah, you know, it was unfortunate. Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, saying, we've got to look at the bigger picture. Sanctions could hurt the market for our bone saws, which is a gory joke, but very much that idea that Trump is not moving. In terms of comment pieces, you've got in the LA Times, Trump, the quote there in the LA Times is, he just does not care. He's not taking it on board. He's not taking it seriously. That piece is saying...
Will Lindsey Graham's trolling change his mind?
Absolutely. Will Lindsey Graham, a top Republican, now a pro-Trump ally, will he be able to show some influence? And the message is that from the LA Times, Trump has to show some of the indignation that Graham is showing, but he's not going there. He's actually using more the style of Melania Trump's jacket. I really don't care, do you? If you remember that jacket that Melania wore, and that's the last comment from the LA Times there. Also out there in the US press, this whole story of business dealings between Trump. The Washington Post revealing this week that a Saudi-funded lobbyist paid money directly for 500 rooms after the 2016 election. So that bubbling along, always pointing at Trump's business dealings. But then when I look through the Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, and the US press, that he is not moving. He's not ceding to Republicans on this. Let me go to more cartoons. You can see that in the Arab press, they are very gruesome there, the blocking to the people on the ground. And just in terms of one last tweet, we've got the UN Food Programme saying, Martin Griffiths has written in the New York Times about these talks in Sweden and his hopes, but the threat of famine is real. The UN Food Programme is saying the statistics could go up to something like 20 million, which is most of the population of Yemen, in dire need. So again, that dreadful situation of global geopolitics.
And we're seeing the beginning of a controversy between the charities over whether or not to already use that term of famine. Many thanks for that, Nicholas Rushworth. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.